Hello everybody and welcome to another faction guide for Divide et Impera, the mod for Rome 2. Today we're going to be looking at Cimmeria, or the Bosphorian Kingdom as they're called in this mod. Now, the Bosphorian Kingdom offers an enticing mix of Greek units as well as steppe units, and they honestly fuse together to form this really bizarre dynamic that you don't experience with any other faction, because you have blocks of stationary phalanxes and 4x spears and 4x swords paired with some rather light, very quick and agile, but simultaneously quite deadly and skilled Scythian cavalry and skirmishers. Now, the Bosphorian Kingdom does have some significant weaknesses that we will go over when it comes to the roster. However, their start position is by far one of the easiest in the game. So without further ado, let's look into this faction and see what they're all about. Alright everybody, so this is a start that you have as the Bosphorian Kingdom, and to be frank with you, it's a very powerful start. It's a luxurious start, it's an easy start. And this is because you have a very strong province completely at your disposal from turn 1. Now, the Bosphorus province is equipped with 2 resources. And this settlement here, I'm going to pronounce this horribly, but Phanagoria, you have wine, and then over here in Tanais, you have grain. Now, wine and grain are both exceptionally useful resources. Wine gives you good income as well as a boost to public order, which honestly, I don't know why wine would give you plus public order. I find that people under the influence tend to not be particularly orderly, but that's just me. I gotta question Rome 2 logic. Now, Tanais gives you grain, which basically it buffs your agricultural income throughout the province, as well as increases the foods that you get from farms. So you have the potential to form a very strong agricultural economy over here in the Bosphorus Kingdom. However, you do need to concern yourself with public order from the onset, because nomadic culture in this province is dominant, meaning that you're going to have public order debuffs from the very onset. So the way I would probably construct this province from turn 1 is, first of all, over here in Tanais, you have like a 3 building slot. I would just build a nomadic outpost. This is going to help you recruit your nomadic units. They're going to be very important to making your early game army somewhat viable. So I would definitely do this. Now over here, you can see that you have a port in every single settlement. Again, a very powerful tool at your disposal. I would use 2 of the ports to build fishing ports, and I would use this one to build a harbor, so your commerce thrives. I would probably also just upgrade this because you get a lot of money out of wines, so you might as well. And I would actually dismantle this in order to build some sort of temple or something, just to enhance your public order. You can always make more farms, over here or over here, so I feel like it's kind of worth it to get a temple built right away. And I would most likely just build an amphitheater here, just because why not? We want public order to be positive as soon as possible to enhance our tax income, to make our campaign easier. So why not just do this? Now, when it comes to diplomacy, you don't have an excessive amount of things going on. You have a trade agreement with the Royal Scythians, but you're probably not going to uphold it. Expect these guys to break for trade agreement rather quickly, probably within a turn or 2 of the campaign starting. At most, the trade agreement will last a max of 5 turns before the Royal Scythians decide to dismantle it. Now, you'll also have a war here with Cyracena, and this war, I have very mixed feelings about it, because ultimately you don't really need to go into Scythia, and frankly, Scythia is by far one of the most crappy provinces in the game. It doesn't have vast populations, the settlements are incredibly spread out, and if you want to campaign here, once you actually get deep into Scythia, and the settlements are super spread out, so you see here, the capital is on the other side of the world. It takes 2 years to get here. And by the time you get here, you're going to have no supplies. You're going to be suffering from extreme attrition. There's literally no good reason to covet this territory. So if I were you, this is my personal play, I would either just subjugate these people or liberate them. I just send an army, just quickly defeat them in battle but not take the settlement. Or I would just get a peace treaty, because you can see that these guys are willing to let the war go for almost nothing. So I would just do that, and then I would start to build up troops to go to war against the Royal Scythians. However, your early game roster is really, really bad. I haven't seen this little recruitment capacity out of any of the other factions I've covered in Rome 2. In fact, I would not be surprised at all if this is the smallest roster that you can recruit in turn 1 out of any faction. And by the way, there's nothing of exceptional value here either. Like, you have basic levy hoplites. You have Thracian footmen, which admittedly these guys are a very solid like early game unit. Like the Thracian footmen, they can go toe-to-toe against the vast majority of turn 1 infantry and win, at least when it comes to barbarian infantry. I'm not talking about like civilized infantry like what the Macedonians will field, but against the majority of barbaric infantry, particularly that of the Scythians, these guys will dominate. But at the end of the day, they're hardly some sort of exceptional, amazing unit in general. They only have 8 armor, which will make them rather susceptible to arrows. But, you know, at least there's something. You can also get the Proto-Slav levies, which are your generic levy. These guys have spears, so they'll do well against cavalry, as well as they have the same armor as the Thracian footmen. So, to be honest, if you're just making a fully anti-cavalry army, then these guys might be worth recruiting. However, the Thracian footmen also come with 2 javelins because of the experience buff that they're going to get. So it might be worth to get them too, because if the enemy cavalry gets close enough, you can cast your javelins, and if the Scythians decide to bring whatever infantry they can recruit, then your Thracian footmen can defeat those infantry soundly, while your Proto-Slav levies will probably be of a similar caliber and might lose. Now, you obviously do need a lot of archers, and to be frank, the ideal counter Scythian strategy is just bring like somewhere between 6 to 8 archers, probably closer to 8. Bring a ton of infantry, have the infantry arrayed as a solid line in front of you, and then use the archers to kill the enemy cavalry. So the infantry are basically just a glorified screen, while the archers actually do all the killing. Because you're never going to catch the enemy light horsemen, you know, the hordes of horse archers that these guys are going to bring. They're going to be completely uncatchable to you. So the only way you could possibly kill them is with your archers. It's the only viable strategy you possibly have. And yeah, I would just do the Thracian footmen. I would not get the levy hoplites, because these guys only have 150 men and 15 armor. So they're honestly not going to shield your men as well as the Thracian footmen. They're also more expensive, and the Thracian footmen have javelins, so they can actually potentially fight back if the enemy horsemen get close enough. While these levy hoplites, they can just sit there and take it. So I feel like the Thracian footmen will be a better screen and have a lot more versatility. So yeah, your early game army is just going to be a bunch of footmen, a bunch of archers, and that's what you're going to have to work with until you get better units. And you know, problem is that you are going to have to wait a decent amount of time to get those better units. You have to research logistics, then organize supply in order to unlock the level 2 barrack, and then you have to wait 6 turns for it to be constructed. So that's a total of 14 turns until you can finally recruit slightly better units. If those slightly better units are still limited in span, you can see you can get some Bosphorus Lancers, some very, very basic units, some armored horse archers, these are basically like the Bosphorus equivalent of citizen cavalry. They're a little bit cheaper but have less armor, and you can get your basic Greek hoplite. So it's not like you're unlocking some sort of amazing units. Like this type of unit would be available to a faction like Athens from like turn 1. Okay, like you basically have to wait like 20 turns to actually start recruiting decent troops, because what you have here, this is like terrible. Now, you do admittedly have access to some mercenaries in this territory. You can get your Thracian warriors, your Thracian peltas, your Bosphorus mercenary hoplites, who, you know, they're decent. They're basically like Bosphorus hoplites. But in order to fight the Scythians, you just need archers and you need some sort of infantry to screen. This tactic works pretty well. I've used it viably, and it worked for me. And, you know, you do have quite a bit of money, as I don't think anyone would be surprised by that. You have a lot of territory right from the onset. So I would just use the money to spam these cheap units and then just take advantage of your numbers and pummel the enemy horse archers into submission. Yeah, when it comes to expansion, I would recommend that you take Sarmatia first. It's a reasonably strong province to get economically. And to be frank, you can't trust any of these nomadic factions on your border. So it's just best to get rid of them, you know, kind of for defensive reasons. And after you've taken Sarmatia, the world is really your oyster. You can expand anywhere that you want. The Bosphorus do have a pretty free playthrough just because of how easily defensible your home province is. You can assemble a navy and you can sail across the Black Sea towards Pontus and take it. Although I wouldn't recommend it because your army is overwhelmingly hoplite based at the beginning of the game, and you're going to be facing a lot of pikes here, and hoplites get crapped on by pikes, so I just feel like this is not your arena to show yourself off in. But I feel like after you take Sarmatia here, Dacia is an easy target, and Dacia has a pretty bad early game roster, so you can pretty easily take on the Dacians. Or I would just head north and take on the Germans. I mean, you can see German territories are kind of against the edge of the map. So you're kind of expanding your empire in a very easily defensible way. The Germans don't tend to create diplomatic alliances until later in the game, so you can kind of do it without worrying too much. But in any case, that's all I have to say about the Bosphorine start position, as well as what your campaign strategy is going to look like. Now let's look at the buffs and debuffs that the Bosphorus Kingdom gets. Now, when it comes to all of the colonist factions, you have the exact same buffs on the top here. One of them is the colonists, which gives you special population technologies. Now, this refers to the double barrack system that you have, and in all honesty, it's basically just a wasted buff. But that's literally what it is. This doesn't really do anything for you. It doesn't provide anything of immense value, but it is what it is. Now, you also get independence, a plus 10% melee defense during battles in your own or allied territory. I mean, in Rome 2, the vast majority of your time is spent expanding and thus fighting on enemy territory, so I don't feel like this is particularly useful, but, you know, any buff is helpful, so just know that if you fight on your own territory, you do get a plus 10% melee defense bonus, so if you're operating close to home and you're in a war with the faction, and you see the potential to fight on your territory rather than your opponents, remember, you're going to get plus 10% melee defense, so you might as well do it. Now, when it comes to the Bosphorine Kingdom's own buffs, you get increased agricultural income, just a useful thing. You're inevitably going to have agricultural buildings because you have to feed your population, so regardless of if you decide to prioritize agriculture or if you don't, this is still going to get you some extra money, so why not? You also get decreased foreign culture public order penalty, which is really, really, really strong. It's really, really, really strong, particularly because you're not in an area with immense amounts of Greek factions. So, you know, this is ultimately going to help you quite a bit. It's going to help you keep control of your territories as you conquer them, so why not? Now, this isn't a huge, huge decrease, but it's still useful. But you do have increased empire maintenance as your debuff, which is really, really, really sucky. I mean, increased empire maintenance basically just taking money out of your pocket every single turn without you doing anything. So, yeah, that kind of sucks, but it is what it is. The Bosphorine Kingdom, this increased empire maintenance does add up, and you do struggle to field armies once your Imperium level gets high enough. Make sure to do plenty of research and create buildings that will lower your empire maintenance, because your empire maintenance can get pretty out of control once you expand large enough. But in any case, guys, that's what the debuffs are. Those are the buffs. Hope that they made perfect sense. Now let's look at the roster of the Bosphorus, and this is where things might get a little bit hairy, because to be completely frank, while the roster is cool, it does have some pretty gaping and obvious weaknesses. So let's take a look here. So this is the roster of the Bosphorus Kingdom, and the thing that should be apparent to you from the very onset is that there aren't a whole lot of infantry units at your disposal. So you gotta think to yourself, that these infantrymen, they better be good. Because if they're not, then I'm not really gonna have a whole lot to use in my campaign. I'm gonna have to make do with very little. And as you can see, you have significantly more cavalry options than infantry options. So that is very true. Your infantry selection is rather limited in this campaign. And to be completely frank, you have decent infantry for the beginning of campaign. You have pretty crap infantry in the middle, and then at the very end, you kind of go on a bit of a redemption arc, and I'll show you what that means, but first we gotta cover the generals, as we always do. Now, you have your elite hoplite general. This is the Bosphorine Royal Guard. They look really, really cool. They have these, brilliant white and red capes, along with, this blue aesthetic as well. So they look absolutely pristine. They kind of have, a similar vibe to the Scipii in Rome 1. But ultimately, there's nothing particularly unique about this hoplite. It is an elite hoplite. It's basically middle of the line elite hoplite. I like to separate elite hoplites into three categories: bottom tier, The ones that are completely mid, average, and mid elite tier. The ones that are slightly better than all the rest. This one is right in the middle. The weaker ones would have less armor. Like there are hoplites in this game, elite hoplites that have 35 armor rather than 38. 38 is perfectly average. The vast majority of them have 38. The elite ones have like 40 or 41, like the Spartans or the shield bearers of Macedon or the Seleucids. But this one's just average, so use them if you like, but they're so damn cool that I use them a lot, purely because I like looking at them. Now, the Bosphorus Noble Cavalry is kind of a weird cavalry unit, because typically when it comes to companion-style cavalry, and this is basically a companion-style cavalry, typically they come in two forms. Either the better ones that have 15 melee attack, and then all the other stats kind of are better, or the weaker ones that have 13 melee attack. This is one of the weaker ones. It has 57 charge instead of 60, which would be the elite one, and 13 melee attack instead of 15, and 5 melee defense instead of 6 melee defense, like a better one would have. But it has 41 armor, which is actually better than average. So ultimately, this Bosphorus Noble Cavalry, it's kind of a mix. Like, its attack stats aren't the best, but the armor is pretty solid. And frankly, if you're going to be fighting against a lot of Scythians in early campaign, it's actually very useful to have extra armor. So, kind of like this unit for what it is. It's very well adapted to the territory in which it operates. So, yeah, it's useful. And obviously, any type of shock cavalry that has a very heavy mass is going to be quite useful in any campaign, particularly if you have phalanx infantry, so you can do your hammer and anvil using this cavalry. It's just a useful cavalry to have, but it's by no means one of the best Greek-style cavalry units in the game. It's just kind of very, very mid, maybe even lower mid if you like want to put it into that like elite cavalry echelon, since it doesn't have a 60 charge or whatever. But moving on, you have your Bosphorus Royal Cavalry. You get these guys with the 4 extra forms, I believe, and they are very, very, very much an elite cavalry unit. I mean, you can see that they have absolutely amazing stats here. Like, they're very heavy. They have at 15 attack, but elite 15 attack, but elite 60 charge. It has a weapon damage of 29, which is solid, as well as some AP and some bonus. There's infantry and stuff. 51 armor is great, and these guys have 5 ammunition too, so they can shoot some arrows before going into combat. And, you know, typically units that, you know, have a little bit of ammunition end up losing out on the stats front, but these guys have really, really good stats. The only thing that this one kind of lacks is that it has only 5 speed. And, you know, I think everyone likes for cavalry to be pretty versatile, pretty quick. And 5 speed is rather low, so that's definitely the falling point of this particularly cavalry unit. And, you know, usually when you have 5 speed, you're talking about like a cataphract cavalry or something like that. You know, something that's insanely heavy and just packs a wallop on the charge. But this isn't as heavy as a cataphract, nor as well armored as a cataphract, so ultimately, that 5 speed is a little bit awkward for this unit, but it still is an incredibly powerful unit with amazing stats. This is definitely one of the main killers of your roster. Definitely the height of elitism when it comes to the Bosphorus Kingdom. Now moving on to your infantry. This melee infantry part is a humongous, gaping weakness for the Bosphorus Kingdom, and this is primarily because these units don't complement each other extraordinarily well. Like, the Bosphorus Kingdom desperately needs some sort of stable units to support the phalanx infantry, but instead of stability, they get a whole lot of tools that in other hands would be more useful, but in your case, they just don't really go well because you don't have anything to hold your flanks until you get to the 4 extra forms, and then you get some pretty average units for that. But starting from the beginning, you have your Scythian Axemen. Now, as a typical Axeman is, these guys have incredible armor penetration. They more or less ignore armor when they actually strike a hit. Simultaneously, they barrel in, screaming, howling, and pack an impressive 26 charge bonus. That's where this unit performs well. Now, in terms of melee attack and melee defense, this unit is really, really bad, and it only has 1 armor as well as a light mass. Now, they do have 4 javelins too, so they can skirmish a little bit before going into the fray, but 33 morale is incredibly low. That's like as bad as like an archer. So I personally don't really like using this unit, but it clearly is just a unit that's supposed to like support on the flanks. They're supposed to throw their javelins in when like the enemy charges something else that you have. Like, say you have like I don't know, like Bosphorine Threo Spears. These guys like take the charge. There's a couple of Scythian Axemen behind him. They throw over javelins and then wrap around and charge the enemy in the rear. That's the only thing these guys can be used for. If you use them to take a charge, they will bolt and die very quickly. Now the Thracians we covered. They are a great, stable, early game infantry unit. Sadly, you do not get upgraded Thracians. Unlike the Adricians who get the Furrows Thracian infantry and then the late D swordsmen going into late game, you only have your Thracian footmen, and these guys just aren't particularly strong in late game or even in mid game. They're only good for early game because they do charge better than most swords, they have high weapon damage and armor penetration, you know, and 225 men. So, you know, these guys will help you in early game, but as you go into late game, you'll find yourself not looking at them at all. But your first couple of armies will have a ton of these. Now, this unit has far more survivability, although I believe that it comes from your second population class when it comes to the Bosphorine Kingdom. So, you know, these guys are available for the Adricians, and I think maybe one of the Celtic factions that borders near there. I don't remember that actually, but because obviously are available for the Adricians. And this is a strong unit. This is a very strong unit, the Ramphia Warrior. 33 charge makes this pack a charge similar to that of a cavalry unit. 11 armor penetration allows them to ignore armor, but unlike the Axemen, they have far higher weapon damage, as well as far higher melee attack, meaning that they score hits far more often. This unit is a glass cannon though. It only has 10 armor, and I've tested it out in like custom battles, but if these guys get hit by 2 volleys of javelins, and I'm not talking about, you know, elite javelins thrown by a good skirmish unit, I'm just talking about like the typical javelins that any infantry unit will have, then these guys become effectively useless. They can't hold up to anything. Even if they get a charge, they'll get a couple of kills and then all die to basically any decent infantry unit. So you really have to keep these guys in your rear, in your reserve, or kind of behind your men on the flanks before you use them. But if these guys charge something without getting hit by cavalry or getting smashed by javelins or whatever, then they can beat a far more expensive unit pretty convincingly in battle. So these guys are useful, but you need to use them the right way. And that's what I'm saying here. Like, I think we've already shown here, right? You have like a stable unit with low armor, so they won't be stable later into the game. And you have 2 very unstable units that are more of like a complement, more of a support, more of the X factor, but not the basic thing that you base your strategy around. And speaking of that, you have another X factor, your Scythian medium axemen. Now this is an upgrade on your light axemen in every way outside of on the ammunition front, since these guys only have 1 javelin. They're no longer as capable as skirmishers. But unlike these guys that only have 1 armor, these guys pack a decent 20. They do the same armor penetrating damage, but the medium axemen pack way better combat stats with higher charge, higher weapon damage, way better melee attack and melee defense, but more importantly, they have like 10 more morale and the 20 armor. That's the main thing. This unit's actually survivable. Now this is as close as as you're gonna get when it comes to like a decent unit to hold your flanks in mid game, and again, like 20 armor is pretty valuable. 20 armor is definitely beatable. And this unit, it's a type that you really do need to get a charge for it to be combat effective. If these guys don't get a charge, then they die. They die pretty comprehensively. And obviously, if we're fighting against something that doesn't have a lot of armor, like we're fighting against like a berserker type unit, they'll get smashed. Like the medium axe, like any type of axeman, the beauty of the unit is that they can basically ignore the type of armor that would make an elite unit invincible, typically. But if we're fighting the type of armor, the type of unit that's like high charge, high combat stats, but low armor, like any type of like Nervii infantry, a Gallic champion, that type of thing, but these guys would get blitzed because their combat stats are actually way worse than typical. Like a swordsman would usually have more weapon damage, way more melee attack, defense, more armor usually. Like these guys, they suffer against low armored units, so be wary. If you're fighting like the Germans or something that don't have the most armor, these guys, they might be combat ineffective. You have to be careful. You know, use them against a nice armored sword or something. But yeah, this is really the best you have when it comes to stability once you're into Furos reforms. It's not a very stable unit though, but it's the best you got, so use them. And even past the Furos reforms, these guys are an absolutely great flanking unit. That's for ideal purpose. That's for ideal. Like, I'm not talking about like these guys hold your flanks. I'm saying that you wrap one around and kind of charge and start wiping out your opponents as if you're kind of, you know, rolling up the enemy line. That's what would be the best use of an axe unit like this. But, you know, it is a decent medium axe unit. That ultimately is what it is. It is a definition of your average medium axe unit. Now moving on, you have your boss for an infantry. Now, I was comparing these guys to a typical 4-axe sword because I feel like that's the most apt comparison. The first thing I noticed is that the 4-axe sword is more expensive. So I thought to myself, well, what's the difference? And the difference is that the 4-axe sword is better. It has 1 more melee defense and it has 3 more armor. And you know, 4-axe swords are ultimately a particularly average, mediocre unit. You know, if you're a Greek faction and your endgame infantry are 4-axe swords and you're fighting against any barbarian faction really, or really any faction that prioritizes melee infantry over phalanxes. So, you know, any barbarian faction, the Romans, the Carthaginians, anything that has competent melee infantry, the late game version of that will beat 4-axe swords. 4-axe swords are basically a placeholder. They'll hold their own and survive for a while you use the rest of your army to figure out how to win the battle. That's what 4-axe swords typically are in late game. And your late game infantry are worse statistically than 4-axe swords in any, like, they don't have a single edge over 4-axe swords. They're just worse. So considering that, this boss for an infantry is pretty weak, and you do have to wait till the 4-axe reforms to get them. Apparently they were inspired by the Romans. Clearly, the Bosporan Kingdom was not inspired particularly well by the Romans. So yeah, this is definitely a weakness, and it is quite characteristic of this melee infantry, which, again, it has some good tools. These Axemen, a very good tool. These Thracian Ramphia warriors, very good tool. But you don't have stable unit that's going to make the dream work here. Not until 4-axe reforms, and this is the only one here. But before that, let's cover the earlier game ones. Now, you do get Scythian Spearmen. These guys are recruitable with your tier 1 Scythian Barrack, and they're honestly not particularly good. The only saving grace of these guys is they do have good melee combat stats for like a low tier early game spearman, right? Your typical early game spear, like militia cheap unit is going to have 7 melee attack and 14 melee defense. It's going to have a more impressive 16 melee defense, and I believe a 22 weapon damage is more than the average. And of course, these guys do excellently in a cavalry brawl, but ultimately where they do suck is they only have 1 armor and 36 base morale, meaning these guys are about as dependable as a McDonald's employee when it comes to showing up to work. Don't recruit these guys, they're just going to run real quick. Also, they only have 150 men. You know, you probably expect like a really low tier militia style unit to have 225 men, but no, 150 really weakens them here. Now, if you do want 225 men, you have to wait till Furos reforms, but then you get your Bosporan Threo Spears. And unfortunately, this is not a very good Threo Spear. In fact, this is one of the worst Threo Spears in the game. Typical Threo Spear has 7 melee attack and 15 melee defense. Like this one. This is your generic Threo Spear. This Threo Spear, it only has 6 melee attack and 15 melee defense, making him less combat effective. And when it comes to other statistics, they're actually just weaker in every regard. They have less weapon damage, less charge. The only thing that this one has in abundance that compares to the other Threo Spear is that it has 20 armor. That's average for a Threo Spear, though. That's not like really good. So this is basically a Threo Spear that's worse at fighting. So yeah. They didn't even want to give you a Threo Spear, which is like a super generic unit for holding the flanks of hoplites or pikes. Like every Hellenic or successor faction basically will put these guys on the flanks once you have the research to do it. Because it just makes sense. Like, they're usually very cheap. They're very cost effective to hold your flanks while your cavalry and your phalanxes do all the fighting. But this unit is kind of bad and unreliable compared to your average Threo Spear, so I don't know, guys. I mean, you might end up using them just because you don't really have a better alternative option, but I almost like putting these Scythian medium axemen more, or at least integrate a good mix of these two. Like maybe have 2 of these Bosphor and Freyo spears on the flank, and then like a medium axeman to support, or maybe you have like 4 units. You have like 2 of these, 1 of these, and 1 of these, because ultimately these guys are going to need help if they're going to survive. If you're going to get beat on the flank by whatever Freos units your opponent throws at you, of course these guys can beat like early game infantry or whatever, but we're probably going to need help if you're facing a competent army at all. Now you do have Bosphor and Heavy Spearmen. You get these guys with the 4x reform, so this is a really late game, where you play out the majority of your campaign by the time that you get these guys. And surprisingly, they are slightly better than a typical 4x Spearman. Now, not by a lot, admittedly, but they do have some cool differences. Your Bosphoran Heavy Spearman is going to have 3 extra armor, which isn't a ton, but, you know, gives you a little bit of an edge. Now, you do lose a couple points of morale here. I think you lose 2 morale or 3 morale. Let's see. You lose 3 morale, so you lose a little bit of morale. But you get 1 volley of javelins, which is pretty huge. I mean, a volley of javelins can be the difference between your unit winning or losing in a one-on-one fight against an enemy unit. So, you know, javelins can do a pretty significant amount of damage. They can absolutely change the course of a battle. And I think that your Bosphor and Heavy Spear also has additional mass too. Now, you do lose the ability to form formations though, so you don't have your heavy formations. So this is a more loose fighting unit. But to be honest with you, you're going to be using your phalanxes in the center most likely. So considering that you need something stable on the flank, the fact that this is a more loosely bound unit is absolutely, there's nothing wrong with that. It actually works to your advantage. So to be honest, this is the unit that you're missing the entire campaign. And you get them right at the end. So you have to wait till like turn 120 to finally have competent, loose fighting melee infantry on the flanks. But once you get these guys, you're set. You can definitely just pair them up with a couple of medium axemen and some Thracian warriors. These guys obviously hold the enemy back, and then these guys wrap around the flanks, or, you know, if you charge into battle first, if these guys wrap, like whatever you want to do. But ultimately, with some nice shock infantry supporting these spears, you can do a lot of damage on the flanks. Now, when it comes to your missile infantry, you don't have a ton of options, which is rather surprising for the Bosphorus Kingdom, which you would assume would be a very skirmish-heavy faction. And to be completely honest with you, only 2 of these units is actually interesting to me. Like these Thracian Javelin men, these guys are incredibly cheap to recruit. I believe that their like typical turn maintenance is like 40. They're insanely cheap, but they suck. They absolutely blow. They have no melee capabilities. They have 80 range, which is really bad for a Peltas. Typically, a crappy Peltas will have like 85 range. 90 or 95 is preferable, but 80 is just horrible. And 20 missile damage is horrible too. Only recruit these guys if you're desperate. They suck. Now you have Scythian skirmishers, as you can see. You increase your range here. So this is honestly, like, all in all, it's not a horrible skirmisher. Admittedly, this one does not have strong fighting capabilities when it comes to, like, close quarters. But you kind of want your Javelin infantry to be capable of doing that, but these guys are also very cheap, so I guess it's kind of redeemable that they don't. You get what you pay for. Now, they do also only have 30 base morale, which is horrible in 1 armor, so they'll drop like flies. And I mean, I've routed these guys at a distance by just shooting them with my arrows before we even cast a single javelin. So yeah, this isn't a super effective unit, but at the very least, it's better than your Thracians. Never get these Thracians. They're a complete waste of space. These guys could do something, but I wouldn't get them either. Now, the Scythian Foot Archer is a massive disappointment. They're an absolute massive disappointment. I was hoping to have like high-range cheap skirmishers with the Cimmerians, because I don't know, when it comes to skirmishers, I typically value range as my main metric in order to judge whether an archer or a slinger is good or bad. But 165 range is your typical range. Now, the only good thing about this archer is that it has 150 men rather than the typical 131. So basically, you get more shots with your archers, because the way that your amount of ammunition is calculated is you take the total ammo from here to 15 and you multiply it by the amount of men in the unit. So basically, every time that these guys shoot a volley before we start losing men, they're firing 15 additional arrows. So they just do more damage cumulatively, which is good. The other thing is that all of these Scythian skirmishers, at least, this one and this one, actually, to be fair, it's not all of them, but this one and this one, these two archers, they use axes in close combat. So you can see we have a pretty lethal charge bonus of 24 and a weapon damage of 16 and armor penetration of 12. Now there's limitations when it comes to this cheap archer because they also only have a melee attack of 5 and a melee defense of 2. And the thing a melee attack does is that it basically determines your chance of hitting the enemy. So, you know, at the end of the day, with only 5 melee attack, a very low number, you're not going to strike the most hits, but the charge bonus in armor penetration will make sure that these guys actually can do some damage in melee. So I wouldn't completely write them off. They can be useful. Additional damage as well as the armor penetration make this a very spicy, cheap archer. But alas, it's definitely not elite for a low tier archer, and like Persian archers will be more useful than these guys and stuff like that. But you know, we're definitely better than like early game archers at the Greek Sked or your typical Hellenic faction. They're a cool unit. Now, once you get to, I believe, your level 2 Hellenic barrack, you can get your Thracian peltas. In Thracian peltas, they're exceptionally good in melee. They give you armor penetration, give you a good charge bonus, a great weapon damage of 21, really good for a skirmisher, as well as 9 melee attack, and 6 melee defense, which are reasonably good attack stats, at least in early game. I mean, of course, this is a skirmisher, right? You're mostly bringing them for your 7 ammunition and 22 missile damage, but Thracians, they serve as a pretty valuable hybrid. They can, you know, cast the javelins aside and go into combat and actually get some kills, especially in early game. So they're definitely a useful unit. Now, we're not some sort of like game-changing unit, but you know, between these guys and the Scythian foot archers, you have some good versatility. But your game-changing unit is right here, your Scythian armored archer. Now, it's rare that an elite skirmisher is useful in Rome 2. You know, typically an elite skirmisher, they are a little bit lackluster. You kind of like end up overpaying for like a spear that's not really combat effective or something like that. But these armored Scythian archers are actually incredible. They are a perfect hybrid between an extremely good archer and a somewhat combat effective melee infantry unit, and I'll show you why. Firstly, you have 185 range. That is the epitome of elite archer, as well as you do more damage per missile. You do 18 missile damage compared to a typical archer's 15 or 16, depending on which faction you're using. So that's really good. You're already hitting really hard, you're shooting really far. That's great. You're shooting relatively quick with 6 shots per minute. These guys have excellent archer stats. They also can survive in a skirmish for quite a while because they have 25 armor, as well as they're considered a medium unit, so they have decent mass. Now when it comes to their melee prowess, I believe that these guys have shields. Also, these guys have 150 men, meaning that they have the typical amount of men you'd have in a melee unit. I mean, it's going to enhance your chances rather than being a small unit for sure. And we have 7 melee attack, 7 melee defense, a charge bonus of 26, and weapon damage of 18, and armor penetration of 13, giving them the same base stats as like an axe unit. Better than this axe unit. At least I believe it is. No, actually, never mind. It actually has the exact same stats as this axe unit. So these guys, they go into combat just like this axe unit, except they have 25 armor and more morale. So these guys have incredible skirmish capabilities, and then they can actually be a semi-effective unit at like charging flanks and stuff like that, as well as they'll butcher any other skirmisher in melee combat except like noble skirmishers, you know, elite skirmishers. So these guys are really, really useful. Their missile damage will be exceptionally high, and I've put these guys into like melee against like decent Dacian units and stuff like that, and they got plenty of kills in melee too. And considering that your infantry line in general, until you get these beautiful Bosporan heavy spearmen, it's going to be somewhat lackluster, I believe that these missile units can do pretty well. And you know what? I skipped phalanxes. I can't believe I did that. You know, I guess there's only 3, so I just kind of overlooked it, but yeah, for your phalanxes, you start out with your Levy Hoplite. Literally nothing to say here. Every single Greek faction has one. I'm not going to talk about them, but they suck, but they're cheap. That's literally all it is. The only reason to recruit these guys is if you are trying to like defend a settlement desperately, like you see an enemy army approaching and you're just rallying whatever you can recruit. Then you can get these guys, because defensively phalanxes are always going to be useful, but Outside of that, very specific usage, I would never get these guys. Now you have Bosphorian hoplites as well, and these guys are comparable to Athenian hoplites, and I'll show you why. You see, your typical hoplite, your typical base hoplite only has 30 armor. Like, I'll show you your typical base hoplite with, I guess we have Rhodes loaded up over here, but the Rhodesian hoplite has 30 armor, as you can see, and 35 base morale. Now, Athens, they have a somewhat unique base hoplite. This hoplite has 39 base morale and 35 armor, so you trade a little bit of morale in exchange for armor. The Bosphorian hoplite doesn't trade anything for armor. They have 43 morale and 35 armor, making the Bosphorian hoplite pretty much the best generic hoplite in the game. Pretty much the best generic hoplite in the game. I mean, you know, there's Parables. Spartans obviously have a pretty unique roster. They have the Perioikoi is worse statistically, I just saw. So, like, literally, you know, I haven't done Massilia yet. I haven't looked at a couple of factions. But as of right now, this is the best base hoplite I've ever seen. And you know what? That additional armor is quite useful because you're operating in a region with a lot of skirmishers. So you want your hoplites to be able to deflect arrows and absorb ammunition and not die. So that additional armor is going to help them do it. So quite a nifty thing. Now when it comes to his Bosphorian Royal Guard, like I said, this is like your generic elite hoplite stats. There's nothing special in comparison to any other Greek faction when it comes to this unit, but a generic elite hoplite is still exceptionally useful. This is still an incredibly combat effective unit. So the center of your line is probably going to compose of like 5 or 6 of either these guys or these guys, just depending on your financial situation, your population situation, and all of that. Now moving on to your cavalry. This is obviously the primary focus of the Bosphorus Kingdom. This is the primary thing that distinguishes them, because overall, when it comes to these units, you know, while you have some Thracian and interesting Scythian axemen and all that, there's nothing overly elite here. And when it comes to your missile infantry, it's only really the Thracian Peltis and the Scythian armored archers that stand out. But I'm telling you, recruit these Scythian armored archers, and any elite army you're raising, have 3 or 4 of these. That additional skirmish capacity will be very much felt. You'll be able to dominate anyone when it comes to foot skirmishers, and then these guys can just join your infantry line as semi-competent axemen later, and really be that extra kind of oomph, that X factor. These guys are a total X factor. But anyway, moving on to your cavalry, we start out with the Bosphorian cavalry. This is basically your citizen cavalry when it comes to this unit. Now, when it comes to this faction, this unit kind of sucks, I'm going to be honest. Compared to your typical citizen cavalry, they have far less armor. They have an armor of 18, which is really, really bad. I mean, if you want to see like your typical citizen cavalry, we need to look no further than Syracuse. Let's go to Syracuse. Got your Syracusan citizens. You can see that this unit has 33 armor, 8, 13, 47. This one has 8, 11, 47, and 18. So effectively, this Bosphorian cavalry is really bad for a citizen cavalry. They're also rather cheap, though. I believe that they go for like the low 200s in terms of income per turn, or maybe like high 100 somethings. So it is an effective unit for the price if you just kind of keep them out of cavalry's range and mainly just use these guys for hammer and anvil, because 47 charge is not bad, as well as to wipe out enemy skirmishers, which these guys will do gleefully, but in cavalry on cavalry engagements, they suck. Now, when you get your level 1 nomadic barracks, you get access to the Scythian Young Horsemen. Now, the Scythian Young Horsemen have horrible armor of only 33. They also have terrible morale. The only advantage of these guys is they have 4 javelins that they chuck before going into battle, and they have semi-decent combat stats with, I don't know, 9 and 12. That's kind of okay. To be honest with you, I never really understood this unit. Like, the only good thing about it is the 8 speed, but the combat stats are horrible, and it's such an unstable unit that I would never invest the amount of money it takes to get these guys on the field if I'm only going to get 13 armor and 33 base morale. Like, for some units where the morale and armor is so low that you really question their ability to do anything. And you know, these guys have 90 men, meaning that they're going to die extra quick compared to 75-man cavalry units. Like, I wouldn't trust this unit to do anything, man. That's the thing. I would avoid these guys personally. I would take Bosphorian cavalry as like your cheap cavalry option, your desperate cavalry option over these guys. Now, you do also have the Bosphorian Lancers, and for a Lancer, this is pretty bad. But this is also a pretty cheap. This is like your mid-tier Lancer unit. Like, these guys shouldn't have the stats of an elite Lancer. They're kind of comparable to, like, Thessalians. Thessalians are, like, in that mid-tier, and so are these guys. And for a mid-tier Lancer unit, you get a lot of good... You get, like, a decent armor stat here with 33 armor. Now, your lowered melee attack and melee defense compared to the elite Lancer, that's completely normal. The 11 and 4 is pretty normal here. The 54 charge bonus is normal. The thing that's less normal is that these guys only have 6 speed. A Thessalian would have 7. So these guys are kind of slow. But I don't know. This is just a decent, cost-effective unit. Don't get these guys tangled up with a citizen cavalry style unit because they will lose in a 1v1 against such a unit. At least in a prolonged melee. However, these guys are exceptionally good for hammer and anvil, but high charge will let them charge down a light infantry unit as well as a skirmish unit with ease. So they're just good. If they come from your second population class, so they're relatively easy to recruit. But if you want to spend your higher population class, I would just get these guys. You know, this is your noble cavalry general. As I said, this unit's pretty average for noble cavalry. It's a bit higher armored compared to your typical unit that goes for its price and has these stats. However, it has slightly worse combat stats. Again, we're kind of seeing that with the Greek units of the Bosphorian Kingdom, right? You have higher armor on your hoplites, you have higher armor on your Bosphorian heavy spearmen compared to your typical thorax swords. It's a pretty typical mechanic when it comes to the Bosphorian Kingdom, at least when it comes to your Greek-style units. But there's nothing really special about these. I just recommend them over your Bosphorian Lancers if you have the money, because they are a better unit, and they'll just perform their task in every way better. But if you don't want to spend your tier 1 population, I get it. You'd probably better spend them on these Bosphorian Royal Guards, since they'll just buff up your melee line so much. Now moving on to your first real Scythian unit that can actually be used effectively, you have your Scythian Lancers. And the thing is that the overwhelming majority of your Scythian units for the Bosphorian Kingdom, they go into combat with axes. So it's a little bit hard to gauge exactly how effective these guys will be in combat, because their combat stats are low, but that's to compensate for heightened armor penetration. You know, it just means that, you know, these guys will perform worse against light cavalry, but they might stand a chance against heavily armored cavalry, at least more of a chance than you'd expect. But also, this is one of those awkward units. It's kind of like a jack of all trades, you know. They can charge into combat pretty well with 56 charge bonus. However, their melee attack and defense gives them rather poor combat stats. And when I use these guys in my campaigns, I did notice that, like, if you leave them in combat with anything for too long, they just tend to die really quickly. I didn't really like these Scythian Lancers. I personally just preferred to use a unit like this Bosphorian Noble Cavalry, or I just save money and get a Bosphorian Lancer. So I feel like if you're trying to get something that's going to be good for Hammer and Anvil, it's just better to kind of go simple here. I feel like this Scythian Lancer doesn't really do anything all too effectively. I just feel like this particular unit is just kind of this awkward middle of the road, where your combat stats aren't really going to help the armor penetration come out that much. So yeah, but these guys can do they can do a competent Hammer and Anvil. They're pretty fast for a unit that is very heavy. That's the thing, dude. 7 speed on a very heavy shock cavalry is crazy. So that's definitely the main highlight of this unit, the 7 speed. But to be honest with you, these heavy Cappadocians might just be a better option, because while they have no ammunition, they do fight better in combat. They still have the same armor penetration while also boasting a higher charge bonus, a higher weapon damage, higher melee attack, and higher melee defense, as well as better armor as well, and higher morale. It's just, I prefer my units to kind of be segregated amongst what their particular, like, tasks would be. Like, I see missiles on my cavalry as either, like, for dominant role, like if you actually go for missile cavalry, or I see it as like a welcome bonus if the rest of the stats of a cavalry are good. But in this case, the rest of the stats aren't good, so I would go for the Cappadocian over these, or better yet, the Scythian Noble Cavalry. These guys are absolute monsters! 49 armor, really good armor, better than these two. 49 morale, really good morale, better than this one, but you still retain the 7 speed. You know, you still retain the speed that's indicative of a Scythian unit, but then the melee stats are actually good at 11 and 10. A charge bonus of 62 is crazy. This unit is also heavily armored. Weapon damage at 19 is great, and of course you do that armor penetrating damage. I tried these guys out against some pretty elite cavalry, and they actually did really well. Like, these guys are akin to the Howling Maidens, or what were they called? You know that, like, unit from Rome 1, the female Scythian unit that goes to town with his axes, and they were capable of, like, beating Parthian cataphracts. Now, these guys won't beat Parthian cataphracts, but they'll beat some pretty heavily armored cavalry in melee while simultaneously being elite when it comes to hammer and anvil because of that 62 charge bonus. I would recommend using these guys as often as possible. This is by far like the marquee unit of your shock cavalry, in my opinion, because this unit it's slow. They only go 5 speed. I feel like that limits their use, and combat-wise, these guys aren't much better than these, because these guys have like your 10 melee defense, so they can actually hold their own in combat reasonably well, while these guys have 6 melee defense, making them more of like a glass cannon. Yeah, I would use these Scythian Nobles. This is my favorite unit by far when it comes to your cavalry. I already covered your Bosphorian Royal Cavalry. It's a beast of a cavalry unit, but I like the Scythian Nobles more. Also, these guys, they have a little arrow slung on the back of his rider, but they have no ammunition, so the Scythian Nobles have no ammo. Now, when it comes to your Missile Cavalry, you have some generic units going at the beginning. Like this Scythian Light Horseman is an absolutely generic horse archer, and it's honestly overpriced. It's honestly overpriced. Like, you pay up the butt when it comes to getting this particular unit, and they have 4 armor. 4 armor, basically like very bad melee capabilities. I don't know, I just wouldn't really use them, to be honest with you. I just feel like it's such an awkward combination to use like Scythian Light Horsemen with the infantry that you have. Like, your infantry aren't going to last long enough for you to really effectively skirmish, so I wouldn't use these guys. But you do have access to your Scythian Heavy Horse Archers, and a couple of upgrades of your barrack, and these guys, they have the same combat stats as your Bosphorian Lancer, which is very interesting, and a competent 49 charge bonus, which is pretty good. Where these guys suffer is they do only have 28 armor, which is really less than you'd get out of the majority of your melee cavalry, but I mean, these guys are actually an effective jack of all trades. Like, these melee stats are actually pretty good for what you get. And I would honestly recommend that you use these guys. Like, your medium horse archer is both options, by the way. Your Greek version, it has more speed and better melee stats too, by the way. They are a slightly worse horse archer, and they are a bit more expensive, but the superior melee stats do kind of make it worth it. Although these Scythian Heavy Horse Archers do have significantly better charge. So if you're looking for a unit that's a horse archer that's going to last better in like prolonged melee, it's going to be your Bosphorian Horse Archer. But these guys are cheaper and do a way better hammer and anvil. So I'd actually recommend these guys for the majority of things, because I just feel like hammer and anvil capabilities is more important than melee capabilities for a horse archer. Because if these guys get caught in melee by a good cav unit, they're going to lose anyway. So why try to focus on improving something that will inevitably go wrong anyway? Just use these guys. But at your top, you have your Scythian Noble Horse Archers, which are such a cool unit because they have the axes. They have the armor penetrating damage. So these guys actually are ridiculously good at melee for a horse archer. You would be incredibly surprised by the amount of damage these guys can do in melee. They're totally worth recruiting. I don't usually go for heavy horse archers, but because of the armor penetrating damage that these guys do, like, I prove them into combat against some pretty elite units, and they actually would do well. They could like defeat like a Roman Equite and stuff like that in melee combat with ease. Not even close. So I would use them because of that. Like, you get your horse archer capabilities, but can also do some anti-cavalry plays. Heck yeah. So yeah, guys, that's the Bosphorian roster. I personally believe that while theoretically the mixture of Scythian and Greek cultures it's an enticing prospect. It feels like it should work pretty well together. I feel like in practice it doesn't really. I feel like I much prefer like the Seleucids that have that Persian influence in their cavalry. So you have like those heavy cataphracts. I feel like they just go so much better with phalanxes, and besides that, you don't have pike phalanxes, which is a massive problem for this roster, a massive weakness. And I really do hate how you don't have infantry even as good as like 4-axe swords, although the Bosphorian Heavy Spearman is definitely a nice addition. And without this unit, your melee core would be absolutely screwed. So when it comes to power, I feel like these guys just rank like a decent, like a 6 out of 10. And I only say that because at least their roster is comprehensive. You have shock infantry, you have, you know, a heavy, decent, competent, loosely fighting unit that you can put on the flanks. You have some decent phalanxes, you have elite archers, you have stable archers, you have some decent peltas options, and your cavalry in general is pretty good. Although it does take quite a while to upgrade your barracks to the point where you start getting these guys, when you start getting the upper echelons of cavalry, when you get your Scythian nobles and all that. But once you have them, you do have some absolutely competent cavalry that can defeat the majority of cavalry you found in Rome too. Right, like your typical barbarian faction, or say the Romans or whatever, like they won't have cavalry as good as these guys. And what do you expect? Like these are Scythian riders, these are born mounted warriors, so absolutely we're going to pound a majority of units into oblivion. But at the end of the day, when it comes to this roster, I do feel like there's kind of a lack of synergy. But for the majority of your campaign, your infantry won't really be up to par. And, you know, honestly, I feel like because you don't have pikes or you don't have a heavy sword, I don't think we'll ever really get up to par. You just have some way to try to build an infantry line, but ultimately, I favor the vast majority of factions infantry over these guys. So because of that, you get maybe a 6 out of 10, maybe 6 out of 5, because I love these Scythian armored archers. Bring them. Bring them if you play this campaign. Be able to redeem it for you for sure. Now, when it comes to difficulty of this campaign, I would personally give it about a 3 out of 10. And the only reason why it even has 3 is because this roster is not the best to use. Like, you may struggle to beat some factions with it, but because of your start position, like, as long as you're capable of winning battles with these guys, like, you just find some nifty way. Like I showed you guys with the Scythians, right? Recruit a bunch of these, recruit a bunch of archers, make a couple of armies, shoot them to bits, use your numbers against them. But as long as you can mold this roster into something effective, you're going to be drowning in money. And you have such an easy start position. It is like, I don't know if it's the easiest start. It's between these guys and the Bactrians for sure for easiest start position. The start position alone just makes this really, really easy, guys. Yeah, the only challenge is when it comes to deploying this roster. That's it. If you know how to, like, play a campaign in Divide et Impera, you'll be able to leverage the start position into an empire in no time. Now, when it comes to how much you need to play this campaign, to be honest, I feel like it's a pretty forgettable one. Like, I played like half of it and then just gave up midway, and I was conquering everything. It just felt really easy, and to be honest with you, like, this roster doesn't feel all that charming to play with. But just something missing that prevents it from being fun. Like, you feel like you're just throwing a motley mix of dudes that don't belong together and trying to fight with them. So I would say in terms of how much you need to play this campaign, it's like a 3 out of 10. Definitely below average when it comes to excitement. And particularly, the start position is so easy that it just feels a little bit milquetoast. It just feels like they gave you an easy start position because this is just supposed to be an easy faction. To be honest with you, this is a good starter faction. If you're new to Divide et Impera, you could try these guys out as like your first playthrough or something. It's probably a great use for the Bosphorine Kingdom. But in any case, that's my 2 cents when it comes to the Bosphorine Kingdom. I hope that you enjoyed this faction guide, and yeah, think about whether you want to play this faction or not. I personally didn't have the best experience with them, but you know, if you're a massive Greek and Steppe fan and you want to see them fused together, this is the only chance you're going to get that experience. So yeah, try them out. See you next time.